This is the beginning of chapter 12. We're going to be looking at the central nervous system. So in this chapter, we're going to look how the brain is organized, protected, and how it is supplied with blood. We're going to look at the different areas of the brain and see their functions, and that functional organization of the brain. We're also going to be looking at the spinal cord and spinal nerves, looking at their anatomical features, and also looking at the functions of the spinal cord and spinal nerve. Really, when it comes down to it, we're looking at how the central nervous system as a whole maintains homeostasis in the body. So the adult brain consists of four major parts. These are the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, and the cerebrum. So the brain stem is going to be continuous with the spinal cord down here. And it consists of a couple parts. We have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain are the three main parts of the brain stem. Now just posterior to the brainstem is the cerebellum. Just superior to the brainstem is the diencephalon, which consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. Now supported on top of the diencephalon and the brainstem is the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. So first we will discuss the cerebrum. So this is kind of called like the seat of intelligence. This is the part of the brain that provides us with the ability to read and write and speak. Now the cerebrum consists of an outer cerebral cortex, and an internal region of cerebral white matter. And there's also going to be gray matter of nuclei deep within the white matter. Now the cerebral cortex is going to be this region of gray matter that forms the outer rim of the cerebrum. During embryonic development, when the brain size increases very rapidly, the gray matter of the cortex enlarges so much faster than the deeper white matter. And as a result, the cortical region will roll and fold on itself. Now these folds are called gyri, or singular gyrus. The deepened grooves between the folds are known as fissures, and shallower grooves between the folds are called sulci, or singular sulcus. The most prominent fissure is the longitudinal fissure, and this separates the cerebrum into right and left halves called hemispheres. Now the cerebral hemispheres are connected internally by a corpus callosum, and we will see that later. This is a really broad band of white matter that contains axons that extend between the hemispheres. We will see it later, but I'll write that here. So there's kind of this big connection between them internally, which is called the corpus callosum. Now each hemisphere can be further divided into several lobes. The lobes are named after the bones that cover them. So these are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, temporal, and occipital lobes. The central sulcus here separates the frontal lobes from the parietal lobes. There's a major gyrus, the precentral gyrus, that's located just immediately anterior to the central sulcus. This area actually contains the primary motor area, which we will see later. Another gyrus, the postcentral gyrus. This is located just immediately posterior to the central sulcus. This contains the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. Some other important sulci would be the lateral cerebral sulcus. This separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. And then the parieto-occipital sulcus. This separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Now there is a fifth part of the cerebrum, which is called the insula. This can't actually be seen at the surface of the brain, and this is because it lies deep within the lateral cerebral sulcus. Specific types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals are processed in certain regions of the cerebral cortex. So generally, sensory areas receive sensory information, and they're going to be involved in perception, and perception is the conscious awareness of sensation. Motor areas, these are going to be areas that control the execution of voluntary movements. And then we have association areas. And these deal with more complex integrative functions. So this is much more complex. So this is going to be things like memory, emotions, reasoning, things like will, judgment, personality traits, and even intelligence too. Sensory impulses arrive mainly in the posterior half of both cerebral hemispheres, in regions right behind the central sulci. Our primary sensory areas these are going to receive information that has been relayed from peripheral sensory receptors through lower regions of the brain. The sensory association areas these are often just adjacent to the primary areas, and they receive input from the primary and other brain regions. sensory association areas are going to integrate sensory experiences to generate meaningful patterns of recognition and awareness. So primary sensory areas, this is where the sensory receptors actually send their information. So this is where information is actually sent, but then the information is translated and integrated in the sensory association areas. And so this is so that you can understand and perceive it. So it's not actually perceived or understood until that information goes to the association areas. So first we're going to look at these primary somatosensory areas. These are going to be numbers 1, 2, and 3 just here. These are located directly posterior to the central sulcus, and it receives impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, itch, etc. And pretty much a map of the entire body is present on the primary somatosensory area. So what that means is that each point within this area is going to receive impulses from a specific part of the body. So for example, this part receives from the hands, this part receives from the arms, this part receives from the shoulder, just an example. But essentially, there's going to be a whole map in this area that gets very specific information from specific parts of the body in specific parts, or two specific parts in this brain area. Next, we will discuss the primary visual area here. This one is numbered number 17. This is located just at the posterior tip of the occipital lobe. And it receives visual information, and it's going to be involved in visual perception. Then we have the primary auditory area, which is labeled down here. This is going to be number 41 and 42. And this is located in the superior part of the temporal lobe. This receives information for sound, and it's involved in auditory perception. Then we have the primary gustatory area. This one is labeled 43 here. This is located just at the base of the postcentral gyrus. And this part of the brain receives impulses for taste, and it's going to be involved in gustatory perception and taste discrimination. So this is the taste part of your brain. And then lastly is the primary olfactory area. So this is located in the temporal lobe on the medial aspect, and so we can't actually see it visible in this picture. But the primary olfactory area, it's in the medial temporal lobe. And so this primary olfactory area, this is going to receive impulses for smell, and it's also involved in smell perception. So those were the sensory areas where we're getting sensory information input. And now we're going to look at motor output. So looking at the motor areas of the brain, motor output from the cerebral cortex, this flows mainly from the anterior part of each hemisphere. So anterior to the central sulcus. So first we're going to look at the primary motor area here. This is within the precentral gyrus, located at number 4. So this is actually going to be this whole area here. This is located in the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. And just like the primary somatosensory area, the primary motor area also contains a map of the entire body, where each region within the area controls voluntary contractions of specific muscles or groups of muscles. So each of these little areas is going to represent a different part of the body and is going to be able to control a different part of the body. So just like that primary somatosensory area, we also kind of have a map of the body on the primary motor area. Then we have the Broca's speech area. This is kind of going to be labeled here 44 and 45. So this is located in the frontal lobe close to the lateral cerebral sulcus. And Broca's area is part of the brain where speech is produced from. So actually we don't need to bracket there, but this is where speech production occurs here. So Broca's speech area, this is going to control muscles of the larynx and pharynx and mouth. And it also controls breathing muscles to regulate the proper flow of air past the vocal cords. So on this slide, we have the association areas of the cerebral cortex, and these are going to consist of large areas of the occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes, as well as some areas in the frontal lobes anterior to the motor areas. So our first area here is the somatosensory association area. So this is going to be sections 5 and 7 here. This is just posterior to, and it receives input from the primary somatosensory area. And it also receives input from the thalamus and other parts of the brain as well. So the somatosensory association area allows you to determine the exact shape and texture of an object, and it also has a big role in the storage of memories of past somatic sensory experiences. We can also add in here memories. And when I say memories of objects, I'm meaning memories of like the shapes of objects or the texture of objects, of like the specifics of objects. Next, we are going to go over the visual association area. This is going to be numbers 18 and 19 here on this brain diagram. So this is located within the occipital lobe, and it receives sensory impulses from the primary visual area. So this is going to be down here, maybe here, different color here. So it receives input from that primary visual area. And it also does receive information from the thalamus too. So this area is going to relate present and past visual experiences, and it's really essential for recognizing and evaluating what you see. So now we have we call it the facial recognition area. It's not specifically labeled here, but I'll put it down here. So this is going to be this whole area, 21, 20, 37, consider this all the facial recognition area. So this is in the inferior temporal lobe, and it receives impulses from the visual association area. So we're going to get impulses from here to over here. So this area is going to store information about faces, and it allows you to recognize people by their faces. Next, we're going to talk about the auditory association area. It's going to be here, number 22. So this is located just inferior and posterior to the primary auditory area. So that one's here at 42, recall. And this auditory association area allows you to recognize a particular sound, things like speech, music, or noise. This is where recognition of past sounds comes from. Now, this next area, here at number 11, we're going to label this one a little bit differently here. So this one will be called the orbital frontal cortex. So this is along the lateral part of the frontal lobe. This is where we're going to receive sensory impulses from the primary olfactory area. Recall that primary olfactory area is in the medial aspect within the temporal lobe, so we can't really see it from our view here. But this orbital frontal cortex at number 11 receives sensory impulses from the primary olfactory area. And this area of the brain allows you to identify odors and discriminate among different odors. Okay, next we're going to come back to the left side of this figure here to Wernicke's area. So this is number 22, 39, and 40. So it's all this area. You can consider all of this to be Wernicke's area. This is a broad region just on the left temporal lobe, left temporal and parietal lobes. And this is going to interpret the meaning of speech by recognizing spoken words. So this is really important that it just identifies or interprets the meaning of words. So remember that Broca's speech area is going to produce words, whereas Wernicke's area interprets the meaning of those words. Going to erase a little bit of this here because we have a couple more on the left side here to go over. So we also have the common integrative area. This is going to be kind of a large area also. So this is going to be like 5, 7, 39, and 40. So I'm going to use different color here, maybe red here. So it's going to kind of be this area. It's going to be our common integrative area. So this area is going to be bordered by the somatosensory, visual, and auditory association areas. And this area integrates sensory interpretations from these association areas, and this allows the formation of thoughts based on a variety of sensory inputs. So it's going to kind of integrate everything from the somatosensory areas, from the visual and auditory, so that you can kind of get an entire picture of your environment. Okay, next we have the prefrontal cortex over here. This is going to be kind of another large area again. Going to be covering kind of 9, 10, and 11 all up in here. So this is a quite extensive area, as you can see, in the anterior portion of the frontal lobe. And this area is going to be really well developed in primates and humans. So this area is really going to be concerned with the makeup of a person's personality, intellect, complex learning abilities, that recall of information, judgment, reasoning. All of these more complex thought processes are all going to be part of the prefrontal cortex. And then we can also do complex. Okay, next here is the premotor area up here. This one is going to be labeled number 6. So this area over here. So this is a motor association area that's immediately anterior to the primary motor area. So we see that primary motor area here in red in the 4. And so this premotor area is a motor association area directly anterior to that. And this area really deals with learned motor activities that are complex and sequential in nature. So things like writing would be a complex type of learned behavior. Okay, this is getting a little bit messy, but we'll just cover one more very quickly. And this is going to be the frontal eye field area. So this one is going to be number 8 up here. So this is in the frontal cortex. It's sometimes included in the premotor area because this is going to control voluntary scanning movements of the eyes. So this is things like reading, voluntary scanning. So it's a motor activity, but it's voluntary, and this is the scanning movements of the eyes. Like when you're scanning a page as you're reading it, that frontal eye field area is really engaged. Now, although the brain is almost symmetrical on its left and right sides, there are subtle anatomical differences between the two hemispheres. For example, in about 2/3 of the population, the planum temporale region of the temporal lobe that includes Wernicke's area is 50% larger on the left side than on the right side. Physiological differences will also exist. Although the two hemispheres share performance of many functions, each hemisphere also specializes in performing certain unique functions. Now, this functional asymmetry, this is termed hemispheric lateralization. Now, despite some dramatic differences in function of the two hemispheres, there is considerable variation from one person to another. Also, lateralization seems less pronounced in females than in males. And this is going to be very prominent both for language in the left hemisphere and also for the visual and spatial skills in the right hemisphere. Precise localization of somatic sensation occurs when nerve impulses arrive at the primary somatosensory area, and this, remember, is going to occupy the post-central gyrus of the parietal lobes. Now, each region in this area gives sensory information from a different part of the body. So you can see here, this part is going to be the wrist, over here the thumb, the nose in this section, lips here, so on and so forth. So essentially there's kind of like a little map of the whole body in the primary somatosensory area. The relative sizes of these regions, these are going to be proportional to the number of specialized sensory receptors within these corresponding parts of the body. So you can see the fingers here are going to be quite large compared to the eyes. The lips are also going to be very large compared to the teeth, so on and so forth. So these relative sizes of the body parts in this picture are proportional to the number of specialized sensory receptors within those areas. The cerebral white matter, this is going to consist primarily of myelinated axons, and these are going to be present in 3 different types of tracts. So our first one are the association tracts. So we can actually see these here. These are going to conduct nerve impulses between gyri in the same hemisphere. Our second type of tract is a commissural tract. So these tracts will conduct nerve impulses from gyri in one cerebral hemisphere to corresponding gyri in the other hemisphere. So we're going to see these here. Now, 3 important groups of commissural tracts. Actually, here, we'll write this first. So these are going to be between Jerry in different hemispheres. These are going to be the corresponding ones on opposite hemispheres, by the way. And so 3 important groups of commissural tracts are going to be the corpus callosum, this is the largest fiber bundle in the brain here. The next is the anterior commissure. And then our last one is the posterior commissure. Here. Okay. Then our third type of tract here is going to be projection tracts. I guess these are going to be plural here. So these are going to conduct nerve impulses from the cerebrum to lower parts of the central nervous system. So to like the thalamus, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. So those will be here. Now, deep within each cerebral hemisphere are 3 masses of gray matter. We call these nuclei. So gray matter in the central nervous system, we term this nuclei. So these 3 nuclei are collectively termed the basal nuclei. They're going to be labeled here. Now, 2 of the basal nuclei lie side by side, just lateral to the thalamus here, and they are going to be the globus pallidus, which is closer to the thalamus, and the putamen. And this is going to be closer to the cerebral cortex. Now together, the globus pallidus and the putamen are referred to as the lentiform nucleus. We can put this one in here. So this one, this one. So collectively, these 2 called the lentiform nucleus. So those are going to be the first 2 of the basal nuclei. So we can just kind of label this 1, and the globus pallidus could be 2, either or. The third of the basal nuclei is the caudate nucleus, which is here. And this will be our third basal nuclei. And this caudate nucleus has a large head. So we can see this kind of on this left picture here. So we have this large head connected to a smaller tail. And this is connected by this long comma-shaped body of the caudate nucleus. Now, a major function of the basal nuclei is to help regulate the initiation and termination of movements. So we'll put this in here. So big function is the initiation and then termination of movements. So the starting and stopping. The basal nuclei also help to control subconscious contraction of skeletal muscles. So examples would be like automatic arm swings when you walk, or true laughter in response to a joke. So we'll also put this in here. So that control of subconscious contraction of skeletal muscles. Because remember, those basal nuclei are going to be masses of gray matter. Remember, those are going to be cell bodies and dendrites of neurons. Moving on to the diencephalon. So the diencephalon, this forms a central core of brain tissue that's just superior to the midbrain. Now it's almost completely surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres, and it contains numerous nuclei that are involved in a really wide variety of sensory and motor processing between the higher brain centers in the cerebrum and the lower brain centers. So the three areas of the diencephalon are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. So the thalamus, it makes up about 80% of the diencephalon, and it consists of these paired oval masses of gray matter organized into nuclei with interspersed tracts of white matter. So we can see these on the picture on the right here. Now there's a bridge of gray matter called the interthalamic adhesion. Now this joins the right and left halves of the thalamus. So this is going to be gray matter, this interthalamic adhesion. Now, based on their positions and functions, there are 7 major groups of nuclei on each side of the thalamus. So we're going to go over each of these. First is the anterior nucleus. So this one going to be right here. It's our first one here. This receives input from the hypothalamus and sends output to the limbic system. So input, we'll just put input from the hypothalamus. And then it sends its output to the limbic system. Our second nuclei group is the median nuclei. This one is right here, that medial. And it receives input from the limbic system and sends output to the cerebral cortex. And then output to the cerebral cortex. Our third is going to be the lateral group. So we'll just label these lateral group here. So nuclei in the lateral group, these receive input. Oh, sorry, wrong color here. Okay, they receive input from the limbic system, also from the superior colliculi, and the cerebral cortex. And it sends output to the cerebral cortex. Now there are a couple of nuclei within this group. First, we have the lateral dorsal nucleus. This nucleus really functions in the expression of emotions. And then we have the lateral posterior nucleus. And then we also have the pulvinar nucleus is part of this lateral group too. And both of these kind of help to integrate sensory information. So those, we can see these on the lateral side here. So we have the lateral dorsonucleus here, the lateral posterior nucleus, and the pulvinar nucleus there. So those are part of the lateral group. Next, maybe put this up here for number 4. Next we have the ventral group. Now there are 5 nuclei that are actually part of the ventral group. We have the ventral, here again, I'll put this different color. The ventral anterior nucleus, the ventral lateral nucleus, these two, kind of go through them as we go through, but these two are both involved in movement control. Then we have the ventral posterior nucleus. Now, this one relays somatic impulses for, or relays impulses for somatic sensations. So things like touch, pressure, vibration. This nucleus relays those types of impulses. So somatic are just going to be like body sensations, touch, pressure, vibration, like I said. Then we have the lateral geniculate nucleus. The lateral geniculate nucleus is going to relay visual impulses for sight. And then last group in the ventral group is the medial geniculate nucleus. And this relays auditory impulses for hearing. Okay, so a couple more groups here, so I'll just erase this and then we can put this here. Okay, so our number 5, we're gonna put just up here. Actually, sorry, for the number 4 for the ventral group, I'll actually show those on the diagram here. So our ventral anterior nucleus is going to be this weird red color one right there. Ventral lateral is our darker red. Ventral posterior is that darker blue color here. Lateral geniculate is kind of on the bottom side, and then the medial geniculate nucleus too. And they're kind of on the bottom side. Next we have our 5th group in the thalamus is the intralaminar nuclei. Now the intralaminar nuclei function in arousal and integration of sensory and motor information as well. This one's also called internal medullary lamina, so that's going to be that white one there. Our number 6 is the midline nucleus. The midline nucleus forms a thin band that's adjacent to the third ventricle, and this one's main function is going to be in memory and olfaction, so smell. So this is going to be that green one, or green colored nuclei in the thalamus here. And then our last group in the thalamus is the reticular nucleus. This one is going to monitor and filter and pretty much integrate the activities of all other thalamic nuclei. Okay, so those are going to be all the groups within our thalamus. Then we're moving on to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is a small part of the diencephalon that's located just inferior to the thalamus, we can see here. And the hypothalamus is composed of about a dozen or so nuclei, but they're all kind of confined to 4 major regions. So first here, this is all really nicely color-coded, so I won't have to write too much here. But our first region is the mammillary region. It's just going to be adjacent to the midbrain. And it's the most posterior part of the hypothalamus. So it includes the mammillary bodies, the posterior, these are going to be, just the 2, the posterior hypothalamic nuclei. So these are going to be the 2 parts of the mammillary region. The mammillary bodies are going to be 2 small rounded projections that really serve as relay stations for reflexes related to smell. Reflexes. So that's an important part for those smell-related reflexes there. Okay, so our next region is the tuberal region, colored in blue here. This includes the dorsomedial nucleus, the ventromedial nucleus, and also the arcuate nucleus. So those are going to be the three nuclei within the tuberal region. Next is the supraoptic region, colored in green here. Now this one lies just superior to the optic chiasm. So this is going to be, optic chiasm is the point of crossing of the optic nerves. And the supraoptic region contains 4 nuclei. We have first the paraventricular nucleus, the anterior hypothalamic nucleus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and the supraoptic nucleus, which is going to be the 4 nuclei of the supraoptic region. And then our last region of the hypothalamus, I'll just quickly erase this here. Our last region here is the preoptic region in purple here. And the preoptic region regulates certain autonomic activities, and it consists of the lateral preoptic nuclei and the medial preoptic nuclei. Now we'll quickly just go over some of the really important functions of the hypothalamus. So I'll put this just here. So these are really important functions. We're going to have 6 of them. So our first important function of the hypothalamus is control of the autonomic nervous system. So the hypothalamus is going to integrate and regulate the contractions of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, and also going to help to regulate the secretion of many glands. So very important control center of the autonomic nervous system. Our second important function is the production of hormones. So the hypothalamus produces several hormones and has 2 really important connections with the pituitary gland. And we will go more over the hormones that are produced and their functions when we talk about the endocrine system. But for now, just know the hypothalamus produces hormones, has those really important connections with the pituitary gland. Our third important function of the hypothalamus is regulation of emotional and behavioral patterns. So the hypothalamus is going to really regulate and participate in the expressions of rage, aggression, pain, pleasure, a lot of those emotional patterns, behavioral patterns, that kind of stuff. The hypothalamus is really important in that. Our fourth important function is the regulation of eating and drinking. I don't spell this right. and drinking here. So the hypothalamus works to regulate food intake. Within the hypothalamus, there is a feeding center which promotes eating. There's also a satiety center which causes the sensation of fullness and like stopping eating. And then there's also a thirst center as well. So all those kind of work together to just regulate overall eating and drinking. Our fifth important function is the control of body temperature. So the hypothalamus also kind of acts as your body's thermostat. So it's going to sense body temperature so that it can send signals if it has to change, increase or decrease body temperature so that your body is maintained at a desired set point. And then our sixth and final important function of the hypothalamus is regulation of the circadian rhythms and your states of consciousness. So the main nucleus that's going to really help with this particular function is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or suprachiasmatic. So remember, this is going to be part of the supraoptic region. And this nucleus of the hypothalamus serves as the body's internal biological clock. And this is because it establishes circadian rhythms. So this is going to be the main nucleus that establishes your daily wake and sleep cycle. So those patterns of biological activity that occur in the circadian schedule, so every 24 hours. This is going to be in the nucleus that's responsible for that. All right, next we have the epithalamus. This is a small region that's just superior and posterior to the thalamus, and it consists of a pineal gland and the habenular nuclei. So these are going to be the two parts of the epithalamus. So the pineal gland, this is about the size of a small pea, and it protrudes from the posterior midline of the third ventricle. Now the pineal gland is part of the endocrine system, and this is because it secretes the hormone melatonin. So as more melatonin is liberated during darkness than in light, this hormone is thought to produce, or to promote rather, sleepiness. Next we have the habenular nuclei. These are involved in olfaction, especially in the emotional responses to odors. So if you remember a certain odor makes you feel a certain way, the habenular nuclei are going to help to connect those emotional responses to certain odors. For example, if you got flowers that smelled a certain way during a happy time in your life, then that emotional response is going to be connected to the smell of those flowers. Moving on to the brainstem. So the brainstem is the part of the brain between the spinal cord and the diencephalon. Now it consists of three structures. We have the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Now the midbrain extends from the pons to the diencephalon. The anterior part of the midbrain contains paired bundles of axons that are called cerebral peduncles. Now, this consists of axons of corticospinal, corticobulbar, and corticopontine tracts, which we will learn all about later. But these tracts conduct nerve impulses from motor areas to the spinal cord, medulla, and pons, respectively. So I'll write this up here. Cerebral peduncle has axons from the corticospinal, so these are specific tracts that we will talk about. These are motor tracts. The corticobulbar, and also the corticopontine. So these are going to conduct nerve impulses from motor areas to the spinal cord, to the medulla, and to the pons. These are going to be different motor tracts. Now the posterior part of the midbrain is called the tectum, and it contains 4 rounded elevations. So you can actually see, maybe we can highlight them here. You can see these rounded elevations here and here. So we have 2 superior elevations. These are going to be nuclei known as superior colliculi. And these serve as reflex centers for visual activities. Then we have these 2 inferior elevations, which are called inferior colliculi. And these are part of the auditory pathway, and these relate impulses from the receptors for hearing in the inner ear to the brain. So we'll say these are so these 2 nuclei are also going to kind of collectively be reflex centers for the startle reflex. So this startle reflex is going to be sudden movements of the head, eyes, and trunk that occur when you're surprised by a loud noise. So for example, if something crashes over to your left, your visual reflex and your auditory reflex are both going to be contributing to the startle reflex that causes you to look towards this loud bang noise and maybe causes a lot of visual craziness too. Maybe fireworks have gone off or something. So this kind of startle reflex comes from the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. Some of the nuclei within the midbrain are associated with 2 pairs of cranial nerves. This would be the oculomotor nerve, which is the 3rd cranial nerve. So this nerve controls movements of the eyeball and also smooth muscles that control pupil constriction. And then the other cranial nerve that is associated with the midbrain is the trochlear nerve, which you can't see on this picture, but it's also labeled up here. But we'll just write this one down here. Sorry, trochlear nerve, which is the fourth cranial nerve. And this nerve provides motor impulses that also control the movements of the eyeball. Now, the midbrain contains several other nuclei, including the left and right substantia nigra, which are labeled here. So these are going to be large and darkly pigmented nuclei. You can see them here, here, and here. Now, neurons in this nuclei release dopamine to help control subconscious muscular activities. So dopamine is a hormone. Also present within the midbrain are the left and right red nuclei. So these are here. These kind of look reddish due to their rich blood supply and iron-containing pigment in their neuronal cell bodies. Now, axons from the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex form synapses in the red nuclei, and this also helps to control muscular movements. So that's going to be a big thing that the red nuclei do. Next, we have the pons. You can see it's right here. It's located just superior to the medulla oblongata and just anterior to the cerebellum. Now, like the medulla, the pons also consists of both nuclei and tracts. It really acts as a bridge that connects parts of the brain with one another. Now, the pons has two major structural components. These are going to be the ventral region and the dorsal region. These are going to be like the structural classifications. Or we'll just say structural regions here. So the ventral region of the pons, it forms this synaptic relay station that consists of these scattered gray matter centers, which are called pontine nuclei. So this contains pontine nuclei. These are going to be gray matter centers. And this is really a complex circuitry of entering and exiting nuclei. And it really plays an essential role in coordinating and maximizing the efficiency of motor output. So these pontine nuclei are going to increase efficiency of the motor output. So it's very complex circuitry in that ventral region. Now, the dorsal region of the pons is more like the other regions of the brainstem, the medulla and the midbrain. It really contains ascending and descending tracts along with the nuclei of cranial nerves. Also within the pons, we have an area called the pontine respiratory group. Together with the medullary respiratory center, the pontine respiratory group helps to control breathing. It works together with a center in the medulla oblongata, which is called the medullary respiratory center. Now the pons is also associated or also contains nuclei associated with the following 4 pairs of cranial nerves. So first we have the trigeminal nerve. This is the 5th cranial nerve. And the trigeminal nerve receives somatic sensations for the head and face, and it also provides motor impulses for chewing. So I'll just put this up here. And then we're also going to use those or provide motor output for chewing. This is the 5th cranial nerve, so I'll just label that with a Roman numeral 5. Next we have the abducens cranial nerve. I'll do a different color here, but this is the 6th cranial nerve, so VI. Just put a line up here. So this nerve provides motor impulses that control eye movement, then we have the facial nerve. Facial nerve is the 7th cranial nerve, VII. This nerve gets sensory input for taste and also provides motor impulses to regulate the secretion of saliva and tears. So sensory input for taste. And then we're also going to get motor output for that secretion of saliva and tears. Lastly, the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is the 8th cranial nerve. And this provides sensory impulses from and also provides motor impulses to the vestibular apparatus in the inner ear. So this is going to be all involved with the vestibular apparatus. In the inner ear. So having to do with balance and orientation in space. So those are going to be those 4 cranial nerves associated with the pons. And the main functional regions within the pons are going to be areas for nerve impulses controlling the voluntary skeletal muscle movements. Okay. The medulla oblongata. This part is going to be continuous with the superior part of the spinal cord, and it forms the inferior part of the brainstem. The white matter contains all sensory ascending tracts and all motor descending tracts that extend between the spinal cord and all other parts of the brain. Now, some of the white matter forms bulges on the anterior aspect of the medulla, and these protrusions are called the pyramids. These are formed by large cortical spinal tracts that pass from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. Now, the cortical spinal tracts control voluntary movements of the limb and trunk. Now, just superior to the junction of the medulla with the spinal cord, 90% of the axons in the left pyramid cross over to the right side, and 90% of the axons in the right pyramid cross to the left side. So this crossing is called the decussation of pyramids. So decussation, this term right here, literally means crossing. And like I said, this is where 90% of axons from either side will cross over to the other side. And this crossing right here, this decussation, actually explains why each side of the brain controls voluntary movements on the opposite side of the body. Because we have axons that are coming in from the left side of the body, about 90% of them will cross over to the right side of the central nervous system within the medulla oblongata, so that as they ascend up the central nervous system, they will end up on the right side of the brain. So axons coming from the left side of the body go to the right side of the brain, and vice versa, about 90%. So not all of them, but majority. Now, the medulla also contains several nuclei. So remember that a nucleus or a nuclei is a collection of neuronal cell bodies within the central nervous system. This is a term we can't forget. So within the central nervous system. So medulla has several of these. Different types of nuclei within the medulla are going to be things like the cardiovascular center, the respiratory center, the vomiting center, and also the deglutition center. So deglutition is swallowing. So all these centers are found, or all these nuclei are found within the medulla oblongata. So this is a part of the brainstem that really controls a lot of different things. Controls your heart, different like how quickly or how slowly your heart pumps is partially controlled by the cardiovascular center. Also breathing, that respiratory center, that nuclei controls a lot of your breathing as well. So a lot of nuclei within the medulla there. Okay, back to a little bit of anatomy. Just lateral to each pyramid is this oval-shaped swelling, which is called an olive. Now, within the olive is the inferior olivary nucleus, this little red squiggle within that swelling there in this picture. Now, this inferior olivary nucleus receives input from the cerebral cortex, from the red nucleus of the midbrain, and also from the spinal cord. The neurons of the olivary nucleus regulate the activity of the cerebellar neurons, so they're going to make adjustments for muscle activity. Now, finally, the medulla contains nuclei associated with 5 pairs of cranial nerves. I'm just going to erase this, and we can put those cranial nerves down here. Okay, so 5 pairs of cranial nerves associated with the medulla are going to be the vestibular cochlear nerves, these are, remember, the 8th cranial nerves. So these provide motor output to the cochlea of the inner ear, relaying impulses related to hearing. So this is going to be the cochlear region of this nerve. Remember, we just talked about earlier in the pons with the vestibular area of this nerve, but now we're talking about the cochlear area. It is the vestibulocochlear nerve, so there's kind of 2 sections of this nerve. So the cochlear part of this nerve provides motor output to the cochlea in the inner ear, so this all has to do with hearing, relaying impulses having to do with hearing. And when we look at the special senses, we look at the inner ear, and we'll look at the vestibular section versus the cochlear section of the inner ear. One has to do with kind of orienting yourself in space, seeing if you're upright or not, and then the other part has to do just with hearing. Okay, the next cranial nerve associated with the medulla is the glossopharyngeal nerve. This is the 9th cranial nerve. So this nerve is going to relay sensory and motor impulses related to taste, swallowing, and salivation. Next is the vagus nerve. This is the 10th cranial nerve. And this nerve is going to receive sensory impulses and also provide motor impulses to the pharynx and larynx, and also many thoracic and abdominal viscera. The vagus nerve is the largest nerve, and we will look more into detail with that one a little bit later. Then the accessory nerve, which is the 11th cranial nerve. The accessory nerve here is going to control swallowing, or the cranial portion associated with the medulla oblongata is going to control swallowing. And then next is the hypoglossal nerve, which is the 12th cranial nerve. And nuclei in the medulla are the origin for impulses that control tongue movements during speech and swallowing. And so this hypoglossal nerve is going to be involved in that. So structurally, there's a few main parts of the medulla. We're just talking about the pyramids and the olivary nuclei. And then functionally, we're talking about the nuclei that control various things. So we have several different nuclei for controlling or contributing to heart rate, contributing to the respiratory rate, vasoconstriction, swallowing. Remember, this is deglutition. Also coughing and vomiting, sneezing and hiccuping. These are all functional processes that are controlled or contributed by the medulla oblongata. Okay, here we have a summary of the functions of the three parts of the brainstem. So here we have the medulla oblongata on the top, and then we have functions on the right. So this table is just going to be very helpful for studying, kind of having that big summary slide going over everything that we've gone over in the past couple slides here. Then we have the pons in the middle, and then the midbrain on the bottom here. Nice summary table. Okay, now we're going to be moving on to the cerebellum. So this is second only to the cerebrum in size, but it's going to occupy that inferior and posterior aspect of the cranial cavity. The cerebellum is posterior to the medulla and the pons, and it is inferior and posterior to the cerebrum. Kind of looks like these little worms, but it has this central constricted area called the vermis, and then it has lateral wings or lobes, which we call cerebellar hemispheres. Now, each hemisphere consists of lobes separated by deep and distinct fissures. We'll see that in the next slide. And there is an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. And these are going to govern subconscious aspects of skeletal muscle actions. So we have this superficial layer of the cerebellum, which is called the cerebellar cortex. And this consists of gray matter in a series of slender parallel folds, which are called folia. The term folia means leaves. And this is because they kind of look like leaves, the folia. Now, deep to the gray matter are going to be tracts of white matter called arbor vitae. So these are white matter, and arbor vitae literally means tree of life. So we kind of have a tree with the leaves, kind of looks like branches of a tree is what this white matter looks like. Now, even deeper within the gray matter are going to be the cerebellar nuclei. These are going to be regions of gray matter that give rise to axons, carrying impulses from the cerebellum to other brain centers. Encircling the upper part of the brainstem and the corpus callosum is a ring of structures on the inner border of the cerebrum and the floor of the diencephalon that constitutes the limbic system. Now, the main components of the limbic system are first the limbic lobe, now this is a rim of cerebral cortex on the medial surface of each hemisphere. So this actually includes several different structures. It includes the cingulate gyrus, and the cingulate gyrus lies over the corpus callosum. You can see it labeled there. This also includes the parahippocampal gyrus, which is in the temporal lobe below, just labeled here. And the hippocampus is actually part of the parahippocampal gyrus that extends into the floor of the lateral ventricle. The hippocampus is labeled here, but that's actually part of the parahippocampal gyrus. Now, our second structure included in the limbic system is the dentate gyrus, or dentate, sorry. And This one, it's labeled right here, and it lies between the hippocampus and the parahippocampus. Next, we have the amygdala. This is labeled here. It's really composed of several groups of neurons that are located close to the tail of the caudate nucleus. The fourth structure is the septal nuclei. That one is right here. The fifth one, I'll put this down here. Fifth one is the mammillary bodies. Remember, that's part of the hypothalamus, but also part of the limbic system here. Those are those two rounded masses close to the midline. Then we have two nuclei of the thalamus are also included in the limbic system. These are the anterior nucleus, and also the medial nucleus. These are going to be two parts of the thalamus, or two nuclei of the thalamus, that participate in limbic circuits. Those are actually labeled here. Well, here we have the anterior nucleus of the thalamus labeled there, and the mammillary bodies are also labeled there too. Those are the mammillothalamic tracts of the mammillary bodies. The seventh part of the limbic system is the olfactory bulbs. Those are right here. Those are flattened bodies of the olfactory pathway, so the pathway that conducts smell, and these rest on the cribriform plate. And then we have the eighth group that constitutes the limbic system. This is several, but actually the mammillothalamic tract is actually going to be part of this eighth bundle of components of the limbic system. So with this 8, we have the fornix, the stria terminalis, the stria medullaris, the medial forebrain bundle, and the mammillothalamic tract. These are going to be linked by bundles of interconnected myelinated axons. So fornix, stria medullaris, stria terminalis, and then that mammillothalamic tract of the thalamus up there. Now, the limbic system is sometimes called the emotional brain. And this is because it plays a really primary role in a range of emotions, including pain, pleasure, docility, affection, and anger. And it's also involved in olfaction and memory. Now, in addition to really well-defined nuclei, much of the brainstem consists of small clusters of gray matter. Remember, these are neuronal cell bodies, and interspersed among these small bundles of myelinated axons, remember, which are white matter. Now, the ascending portion of the reticular formation is called the reticular activating system. So this is also known as the RAS. And this consists of sensory axons that project into the cerebral cortex, both directly and indirectly through the thalamus. Now, the RAS has many important functions, including maintaining consciousness, arousal, awakening from sleep, and even attention. A really important thing that the RAS also does is prevents sensory overload, and it does this by filtering out insignificant information so that it doesn't reach the consciousness. So for example, the RAS is going to be active and this filtering out occurs when you're concentrating on something and pretty much everything else is filtered out. Or when you know things so well that you don't pay attention to other things. For example, if you're driving down a road that you drive down all the time, you may not pay attention to certain small differences along that road because you're just kind of filtering out everything else. That's all completed by the reticular activating system. Now, at any instant, brain neurons are generating millions of nerve impulses. These are action potentials. Now, taken together, these electrical signals are called brain waves. Brain waves generated by neurons close to the brain surface, and many of the neurons of the cerebral cortex can be detected by sensors called electrodes. Now, a record of these waves is called an electroencephalogram. Often this is abbreviated EEG. Now, a pattern of activation of brain neurons produces 4 types of brain waves. First off, here we have the alpha waves at the top. These are present in the EEGs of nearly all normal individuals when they are awake and resting with their eyes closed. These kinds of waves will disappear almost entirely during sleep. Beta waves. These generally appear when the nervous system is active, so that is during periods of sensory input and mental activity. So awake and eyes open, doing things, walking around, activity. Then we have theta waves. These will normally occur in children and adults experiencing emotional stress, and they also do occur in disorders of the brain too. So emotional stress. And so emotional stress in normal individuals not experiencing any brain disorder, but also these do occur in brain disorders. And then we have delta waves. These occur during deep sleep in adults, but these types of waves are also going to be extremely normal in awake infants. So deep sleep in adults and in awake infants. The cranium and the cranial meninges surround and protect the brain. Now, the meninges are layers of membrane that cover and protect your brain and spinal cord. Now, the cranial meninges are going to be continuous with the spinal meninges, and they do have the same basic structure, and the layers have the same names. There's going to be an outer dura mater, a middle arachnoid mater, and an inner pia mater. However, the cranial dura mater has two layers. There's actually going to be two separate layers in this particular layer, but the other two are just one, where the spinal dura mater only has one. So here in this picture, we can see those cranial meninges. So we can see the outermost dura mater here, and there are the two layers of the cranial dura mater. These are the periosteal layer, which connects to the parietal bone. This is the external layer of the dura mater, and the meningeal layer, which is the inner layer. We can also see the arachnoid mater on this picture. You can kind of see it looks kind of like spider legs or veins, or kind of a spider's web, kind of connecting the arachnoid mater to the pia mater, and the pia mater being that innermost layer connecting to the cerebral cortex. Now, the dural layers around the brain are going to be fused together, except where these two layers will separate to enclose dural venous sinuses. So kind of see here this little separation of the two layers of the dura mater. These are going to be dural venous sinuses. These are going to be endothelial-lined venous channels, and these channels will drain venous blood from the brain and deliver it into the internal jugular veins. There's also no epidural space around the brain. So blood vessels that enter the brain tissue will pass along the sheathed, loose-fitting sleeve of pia mater. Now there are three extensions of the dura mater that separate parts of the brain. Our first, here we'll do extension of the dura mater. Again, these are going to be sections of dura mater that separate parts of the brain. Our first one is the falx cerebri. We can see this one here. This separates the two hemispheres of the cerebrum. Then we have the falx cerebelli. This one is found back here. This separates the two hemispheres of the cerebellum. And then our third extension of the dura mater is the tentorium cerebelli. And that one is found here. This is going to separate the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Cerebrospinal fluid, abbreviated CSF, is a clear and colorless liquid. It's composed primarily of water, and it protects the brain and spinal cord from chemical and physical injuries. It also does carry small amounts of oxygen and glucose and other needed chemicals from the blood to neurons and neuroglia. Now, CSF continuously circulates through cavities in the brain and spinal cord, and it also travels around the brain and spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. In this picture here, you can see the 4 cerebrospinal fluid filled cavities within the brain. These are called ventricles. There is 1 lateral ventricle in each hemisphere of the cerebrum. These are usually kind of labeled ventricles 1 and 2. There is also a 3rd ventricle. This is a narrow slit-like cavity along the midline, just superior to the hypothalamus. And it's also between the right and left halves of the thalamus. And then there is a 4th ventricle. This one lies between the brainstem and the cerebrum. Now here we can see a superior view of a transverse section through the brain, and it shows some of the ventricles here. So here we can see a lateral ventricle on the left side. There's also one on the right side. And anteriorly, the lateral ventricles are separated by a thin membrane, which is called the septum pellucidum. Now there are choroid plexuses within each of the ventricles of the brain, and it's actually the choroid plexuses that actually make cerebrospinal fluid. So we can see here, we can see a section through a choroid plexus, and we can see that in the ventricle, the choroid plexus secretes cerebrospinal fluid into the ventricle. Now, the cerebrospinal fluid has 3 basic functions. So the functions of cerebrospinal fluid, the first one is going to be mechanical protection. So really it serves as a shock absorbing medium, and it really helps to protect the really delicate tissues of the brain and spinal cord from jolts that would otherwise cause the brain and spinal cord to hit the bony walls of the cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. So that mechanical or physical protection is very important. Our second function of the cerebrospinal fluid is homeostatic function. So the pH of the cerebrospinal fluid affects pulmonary ventilation and also the cerebral blood flow. And the pH is really important in maintaining the homeostatic controls for brain tissue. So pH is going to be a big factor here. And the cerebrospinal fluid maintains a good pH there. And the cerebrospinal fluid also serves as a transport system for polypeptide hormones secreted by the hypothalamic neurons that act as remote sites in the brain. So pH and also hormone transport. And we have big functions here. And then our third and final function of the cerebrospinal fluid is circulation. So cerebrospinal fluid acts as a medium for the minor exchange of nutrients and waste product between the blood and adjacent nervous tissue. So here we have how cerebrospinal fluid flows around the central nervous system structures around the brain and the spinal cord. So cerebrospinal fluid formed in the choroid plexuses of each lateral ventricle is going to flow into the third ventricle by two narrow oval openings, the interventricular foramina. So it's going to flow through the foramen into the third ventricle. Now more cerebrospinal fluid is added by the choroid plexuses in the roof of the third ventricle. And then the fluid is then going to flow through the aqueduct of the midbrain, which passes through the midbrain, through here, into the fourth ventricle. The choroid plexuses of the fourth ventricle are going to contribute a bit more cerebrospinal fluid as well. The cerebrospinal fluid then enters the subarachnoid space through three openings in the roof of the fourth ventricle, which are the median aperture and paired lateral apertures. So these are the openings through which the cerebrospinal fluid enters into the subarachnoid space. And this is the subarachnoid space in the spinal cord. So the cerebrospinal fluid then circulates in the central canal of the spinal cord and also in the subarachnoid space around the surfaces of the spinal cord and the brain. And as it goes back to the brain, the cerebrospinal fluid is going to be gradually reabsorbed into the blood through the arachnoid villi. These arachnoid villi are going to be little finger-like extensions of the arachnoid matter that project into the dural venous sinuses. Particularly, the superior sagittal sinus is going to be the main dural venous sinus that reabsorbs that cerebrospinal fluid into the blood. So again, the arachnoid villi are going to be little finger-like extensions of the arachnoid matter. Now, normally, cerebrospinal fluid is reabsorbed as rapidly as it's formed by the choroid plexuses. And because the rates of formation are the same as the rates of reabsorption, the pressure and the volume of cerebrospinal fluid remains constant. So pressure and volume of cerebrospinal fluid remains constant because it's formed as quickly as it's reabsorbed. So on the right here, we also have a nice summary of the formation, circulation, and absorption of that cerebrospinal fluid. So at the top here, we have the lateral ventricles, choroid plexuses contributing cerebrospinal fluid into the lateral ventricles. That cerebrospinal fluid would flow through the interventricular foramina into the third ventricle, where the choroid plexuses of the third ventricle are going to contribute more cerebrospinal fluid. Then that cerebrospinal fluid is going to travel through the aqueduct of the midbrain into the fourth ventricle, where the choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle is going to contribute more cerebrospinal fluid. And then all that cerebrospinal fluid is going to go through the lateral and median apertures into the subarachnoid space in the spinal cord and brain, will travel back, circulate back up to the brain, which are then, the cerebrospinal fluid is then going to be reabsorbed into the arachnoid villi of the dural venous sinus, back into the venous blood, back into the heart and lungs. So we kind of have that circulation happening all the time. Now, blood flows to the brain mainly by the internal carotid arteries and also by the vertebral arteries. The dural sinuses are going to drain internal jugular veins, are going to drain into those internal jugular veins and return blood from the head back to the heart. In an adult, the brain represents really only about 2% of the total body weight, but it consumes about 20% of the body's oxygen supply, even when you're resting. So neurons will synthesize ATP almost exclusively from glucose by reactions that require oxygen. Now, when the activity of neurons and neuroglia increases in a particular region of the brain, blood flow to that area of the brain is also going to increase. Now, typically, an interruption in blood flow for 1 to even 2 minutes will impair neuronal function, and total deprivation of oxygen for about 4 minutes can cause permanent injury. If blood entering the brain has low levels of glucose, we're going to get mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, or even loss of consciousness that can occur. So blood flow is really, really important to the brain, and having adequate amounts of certain substances like glucose and oxygen in that blood is extremely important. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the blood-brain barrier. So the blood-brain barrier, abbreviated BBB, not the Better Business Bureau, but the blood-brain barrier, this consists mainly of tight junctions that seal together the endothelial cells of the blood or the brain blood capillaries. And there's also going to be a very thick basement membrane that surrounds those capillaries. Now remember that astrocytes, these are going to be one type of neuroglia that have processes that press up against the capillaries and secrete chemicals that maintain the permeability characteristics of tight junctions. So astrocytes secrete chemicals. So these characteristics of tight junctions. Now there are a few water-soluble substances like glucose that can actually cross the blood-brain barrier by active transport. Other substances like creatine, urea, most ions, they can cross the blood-brain barrier by themselves, but very slowly. And other substances like proteins or antibiotic drugs or therapeutic drugs, these cannot pass at all from the blood into the brain tissue. So really the blood-brain barrier is controlling what substances can cross from the bloodstream into the nervous tissue of the brain and spinal cord. Now, trauma, certain toxins, and also inflammation can cause a breakdown of the blood-brain barrier. So it is really, really important to uphold and maintain this blood-brain barrier, but there are certain things that can break it down. Now we're moving on to the spinal cord. We've talked a lot about the brain and the anatomy and physiology of the brain, and so we're going to be moving on to the spinal cord anatomy. So the spinal cord is roughly oval in shape, and it's a little bit more flattened anteriorly and posteriorly. So in adults, it extends from the medulla oblongata, the inferior part of the brain, to the superior border of the second lumbar vertebrae, L2. Now, when the spinal cord is viewed externally, there's going to be these two conspicuous enlargements that can be seen. The superior enlargement is called the cervical enlargement here, and this extends from C4 down to T1. Now, nerves to and from the upper limbs arise from the cervical enlargement. And then there's also an inferior enlargement, which is the lumbar enlargement. And this extends from the 9th thoracic vertebrae down to the 12th thoracic vertebrae. And nerves to and from the lower limbs arise from the lumbar enlargement. Now, just inferior to the lumbar enlargement, the spinal cord terminates in a tapering conical structure, which is called the conus medullaris. And this ends at the level of the intervertebral disc between the first and second lumbar vertebrae. So kind of right here is where the spinal cord ends. Now, arising from the conus medullaris is it's called the filum terminale. This is an extension of the pia mater that extends inferiorly, and it fuses with the arachnoid mater and dura mater, and really this filum terminale is going to anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx. One other important anatomy here is the cauda equina. Literally means horsetail. These are going to be axons extending from the conus medullaris down into the lower half of the body. These are all just going to be axons of nerves coming from the spinal cord. Here we can see a transverse section of the spinal cord, and here we can see regions of white matter that surround an inner core of gray matter. Now there are two grooves that penetrate the white matter of the spinal cord and divide it into left and right sides. We have the anterior median fissure. This is a wide groove on the anterior side, or this is also known as the ventral side. And then we have a posterior median sulcus, and this is a narrow furrow on the posterior or dorsal side. Now the gray matter of the spinal cord is shaped like the letter H or even like a butterfly. So we can kind of see, I don't know if I use a different color here. You can kind of see this, kind of shaped like a butterfly here. So that's going to be the gray matter on the interior side of the spinal cord. And this gray matter consists of dendrites and cell bodies of neurons. It's also going to contain unmyelinated axons and a lot of neuroglia. the gray commisure here. This forms the crossbar of the H, and in the center of the gray commisure is a small space called the central canal. See that little hole in the middle there? This central canal extends the entire length of the spinal cord, and it's going to be filled with cerebral spinal fluid. Sorry, here, cerebral spinal fluid is what is in the central canal. Now, just anterior to the gray commisure is the anterior white commisure. So actually, I don't know if it is labeled here, but this is actually kind of this section here forms this little crossbar of white matter. It connects the white matter of the right and left sides of the spinal cord. So this here is the anterior white commisure. Now, in the gray matter of the spinal cord and the brain, clusters of neuronal cell bodies form functional groups called nuclei. This should just be a reminder here. So these neuronal cell bodies in the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord here. So the sensory nuclei receive input from receptors by sensory neurons, and motor nuclei provide output to effector tissues via motor neurons. So we're going to have sensory nuclei and motor nuclei. Nuclei. Now the gray matter on each side of the spinal cord is going to be subdivided into regions called horns. So we have the posterior gray horn. So we're going to have a posterior gray horn on the left side and on the right side. These contain cell bodies and axons of interneurons, as well as axons of incoming sensory neurons. So there's posterior gray horn, cell bodies and axons of interneurons and sensory neurons. Now, cell bodies of sensory neurons are located in the posterior root ganglion of the spinal nerve. We will see that just a little bit later. Then on the anterior side, we have anterior gray horns. Now the anterior gray horns are going to contain somatic motor nuclei, which are going to be clusters of cell bodies of somatic motor neurons, and these provide nerve impulses for the contraction of skeletal muscles. Now between the posterior and anterior gray horns are the lateral gray horns, and these are present only in the thoracic and upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord. So we're not going to see these little lateral gray horns just everywhere. Again, only in the thoracic and upper lumbar segments of the spinal cord. So these are going to be these little sections here. Okay, now the white matter of the spinal cord, like gray matter, is also going to be organized into regions. The anterior and posterior gray horns actually divide the white matter on each side into three broad areas called columns. So we have the anterior white column, the posterior white column, and then the lateral white columns. So each column in turn is going to contain distinct bundles of axons having common origin or common destination and carrying similar information. Now these bundles, which may extend long distances up or down the spinal cord, are called tracts. So tracts are going to be those bundles bundles of myelinated axons in the central nervous system. We have sensory tracts. These are all going to be ascending, so going up towards the brain, bringing sensory information toward the brain. And tracts that consist of axons that carry nerve impulses from the brain going down, these are called motor tracts. So these are going to be descending, bringing information from the brain down to our limbs or to our thorax, that kind of stuff. So sensory and motor tracts of the spinal cord are going to be continuous with the sensory and motor tracts in the brain. So let's talk about spinal nerves. So spinal nerves, these are going to be paths of communication between the spinal cord and specific regions of the body. Now there are two bundles of axons, which are called roots that are going to connect each spinal nerve to a segment of the spinal cord by even smaller bundles of axons called rootlets. So here on this picture, we can see the posterior root. Posterior root is going to be right here. Also called the dorsal root because it's on the dorsal side. So the posterior root and the posterior rootlets, these contain only sensory axons. So posterior dorsal root is only sensory axons, or axons from sensory nerves. So these are going to conduct nerve impulses from sensory receptors in the skin, the muscles, and internal organs into the central nervous system. So we can see here on the other side of this picture here, we have nerve impulses for sensations coming into that posterior root because we have that sensory neuron bringing information in. Now each posterior root has a swelling, which is called the posterior root ganglion. And this is going to be the part that actually contains the cell bodies of sensory neurons. And we can actually see that right here. See that cell body there. Now on the other side, the anterior side, we have the anterior root, also called the ventral root. And the anterior root and the anterior rootlets, these are going to contain axons of motor neurons, which conduct nerve impulses from the central nervous system to effectors, like muscles and glands. So from here So here we're going to get motor axons from motor neurons. So we can also see this on the other picture here. We have that cell body of a motor neuron, which is actually inside the spinal cord, but we can see its axon running out through that anterior root. Now, as spinal nerves, you can see that spinal cord or that spinal nerve leaving the spinal cord as they branch from the spinal cord. They pass laterally to exit the vertebral canal through those intervertebral foramina between adjacent vertebrae. However, because the spinal cord is shorter than the vertebral column, nerves that arise from the lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal regions of the spinal cord, they don't leave the vertebral column at the same level they exit the cord. So kind of like we saw before when we were looking at the full anatomy of the spinal cord, we saw the cauda equina. So this is where the roots of the lower spinal nerves will angle inferiorly alongside the filum terminale in the vertebral canal, kind of like wisps of hair. So these are going to be the cauda equina, those nerves that go posteriorly down to the end of the vertebral canal, past where the spinal column ends, or the spinal cord ends. So let's look at some somatic sensory pathways. So somatic sensory pathways, these are going to relate information from the somatic sensory receptors that we just kind of looked at to the primary somatosensory area in the cerebral cortex and to the cerebellum. So remember, somatic means body, so these are going to be sensory pathways from the whole rest of your body. Now the pathway for the somatic sensory pathways involve a first order, a second order, and a third order neuron. So these pathways contain 3 neurons. So these first order neurons, these conduct impulses from the somatic receptors into the brainstem or spinal cord. So from the face, mouth, teeth, and eyes, the somatic sensory impulses propagate along cranial nerves into the brainstem. So pretty much everything like above the shoulders, face, mouth, teeth, and eyes. Well, I guess above the neck, they're going to move along the cranial nerves. Now from the neck, trunk, limbs, and also the posterior aspect of the head, the somatic sensory impulses will propagate along spinal nerves into the spinal cord. Then the second order neurons, these are going to conduct impulses from the brainstem and spinal cord to the thalamus. So axons of second order neurons will decussate in the brainstem or spinal cord. Remember, decussate means to cross over to the opposite side. And then they're going to ascend to the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus. All somatic sensory information from one side of the body reaches the thalamus on the opposite side. And then lastly, we have the third order neurons. These are going to conduct impulses from the thalamus to the primary somatosensory area on the cortex of this same side. And we'll see pictures of this later so that we can kind of put this all together visually. Somatic sensory impulses ascend to the cerebral cortex by 3 general pathways. So I will just write them over here on the left. So our first pathway is the posterior, also called dorsal. So the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. Our second somatic sensory pathway is the anterolateral pathway. This is also called the spinothalamic pathway, almost more commonly called the spinothalamic pathway. And then our third major somatic sensory pathway is the spinocerebellar pathway. So these are going to be our three major somatic sensory pathways. So the first one here is the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, also called the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. And this is going to conduct impulses for things like touch, pressure, vibration, and even conscious proprioception for the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head. Remember that this term proprioception, this has to do with where your body is in space. So that if you move your left arm to the left of your body and you move it in the air, that by proprioceptive receptors, your body consciously knows that your left arm is high in the air, even if your eyes can't visually see it. So that's that sensation of where your body is in space. So here we can see the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, also known as the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. And its name comes from the names of the two white matter tracts that convey the impulses in this pathway. These are the posterior column of the spinal cord and the medial lemniscus of the brainstem. So we can see the medial lemniscus here and the posterior column down here. So these are going to be the two white matter tracts that convey impulses in this pathway. So first order neurons extend from sensory receptors in the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head into the spinal cord. So we can see these coming in here. So this is going to be from the lower limbs and the lower trunk. And then here we can see receptors coming in, or axons coming in from receptors on the upper limbs, upper trunk, neck, and posterior head. So these first order neuronal axons are going to come into the spinal cord, and they're going to ascend to the medulla oblongata on the same side of the body. So they're going to ascend on the same side as they came in. So they will ascend all the way up to the medulla on the same side. Now the cell bodies of these first order neurons are found in the posterior root ganglion of the spinal nerve. So we can see the lower limbs and lower trunk, or the nerves from there, have their cell bodies in the posterior root there and the posterior root here. And these are just different areas of the spinal cord. So here is just the lumbar spinal cord, and up here, the axons coming from upper parts of the body come into the cervical spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, their axons form the dorsal columns or the posterior columns. And the posterior column consists of two parts. So we can see the left and right side of the posterior column right here. And we're going to see those two parts here. So the two parts of the posterior column are the gracile fasciculus. Oops,
right here. The gracilis fasciculus is on the medial side, and the cuneate fasciculus is on the lateral side of the posterior column. Now the axons synapse with dendrites of second-order neurons whose cell bodies are located in the gracile nucleus or the cuneate nucleus of the medulla. Now the difference between the parts of the posterior column are this. The upper limbs, upper trunk, neck, and posterior head are going to go through the cuneate fasciculus and synapse in the cuneate nucleus. So we'll put this here. This is for all the upper limbs, upper trunk, neck, and posterior head. These all go through the cuneate fasciculus and they synapse in the cuneate nucleus. So we can see from this one, actually here, coming in here, we're going to go up in the cuneate fasciculus, this lateral side, this first order neuron, and then here in the lateral cuneate nucleus, here in the medulla, it's going to synapse with a second order neuron. On the other hand, the lower limbs and lower trunk are going to ascend the posterior column in the gracilis fasciculus and synapse in the gracile nucleus. So we can see that here. So from the lower limbs, lower trunk, that first order neuron, which is labeled here, this is going to come up and come up through the gracile fasciculus, that medial side of the posterior column, ascend up to the medulla, and synapse here on that medial gracile nucleus. So different parts of the body will ascend the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway in different areas. Okay, so let's clean this up a little bit here. Kind of know where we are so far. Okay, so now we have synapsed with the second order neurons in the medulla here. So the axons of the second order neurons will cross to the opposite side of the medulla and enter the medial lemniscus. So you can actually see right here is where we have the decussation. So that crossing over, it's the second order neurons that will actually cross over in the medulla. So then those axons will ascend through the medial lemniscus in the midbrain. And the axons will enter, or they will go all the way up to the thalamus. Now in the thalamus, the axon terminals of the second order neurons will synapse with third order neurons. And then those third order neurons will project their axons to the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. So we actually see that receptors coming in from one side of the body will end up on the opposite side of the brain, and same with this side. Okay, we're going to be moving on to the spinal thalamic pathway. So nerve impulses for pain, temperature, itch, and tickle from the limbs, trunk, neck, and posterior head will all ascend to the cerebral cortex along the spinal thalamic pathway. Now, just like we saw in the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, the spinal thalamic pathway is composed of 3 neuron sets. Okay, so here we have those first order neurons labeled here. These connect to a receptor in the limbs, trunk, neck, or posterior head, and they come into the spinal cord. And you can see the cell bodies of the first order neurons are in the posterior root ganglion. And the axon terminals of the first order neurons will synapse with second order neurons very close to where they come into the spinal cord. So you can see they actually synapse right here. Those second order neurons have their cell bodies in the posterior gray horn of the spinal cord. This is where those second order neuronal cell bodies are for the spinal thalamic pathway. Now, axons of the second order neurons, these are going to cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord, pretty much right where they synapse, or at the same part of the spinal cord that they synapse with the first order neurons. So they cross over right away. We can see that right here. So you can see that crossing over of those second order neuronal axons right away. Then these second order neuron axons are going to pass upward to the brainstem as the spinal thalamic pathway, or spinal thalamic tract rather. So here we have the lateral spinal thalamic tract, and the anterior spinal thalamic tract, which are going to be these 2 little areas on the spinal cord you can see here. The axons of the second order neurons will end in the ventral posterior nucleus of the thalamus. And this is where they synapse with the third order neurons. Then the axons of the third order neurons will project to the primary somatosensory area on the same side of the brain as the thalamus. This is going to be the same side of the brain as the thalamus, or the same side of the thalamus that they synapse with the second order neurons, if that wasn't clear. And the third ascending pathway consists of ventral and dorsal spinocerebellar tracts. So they convey information about tendon or muscle stretch to the cerebellum, which uses that information to coordinate muscle activity. So these pathways don't contribute to conscious sensation. The fibers of the spinocerebellar pathways either do not decussate, they don't cross over, or sometimes they cross over twice, so they kind of undo their decussation. So this pathway conveys information from proprioceptors. So remember, these are going to be receptors that kind of detect where your body is or where your limbs are in relation to the rest of your body. And those proprioceptors are going to come from the trunk and lower limbs. And it's going to come from one side of the body, and it's going to end up on the same side of the cerebellum. So we can see information coming in from the left side of the spinal cord here, travels up the left side of the spinal cord, the left side of the medulla oblongata and the pons, and ends up and the left side of the cerebellum. Now this input informs the cerebellum of the movements that are actually occurring, and it allows it to make adjustments in fine motor movements and refine skilled movements. This pathway also works in maintaining posture. So we've discussed all of these already, but this really nice table summarizes them all, and it gives a nice picture of where they're found in the spinal cord or brainstem. So here we have those somatic sensory pathways on this slide and the next slide. So here we have the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. Remember, that consists of the gracile fasciculus and cuneate fasciculus. And then we have the spinothalamic pathway that conveys the impulses for temperature, itch, pain, and tickling. And then lastly on this table we have the anterior and posterior spinocerebellar pathways. Remember, these are going to conduct nerve impulses for proprioception, mainly in the trunk and lower limbs. Now, neural circuits in the brain and spinal cord orchestrate all your voluntary and involuntary movements. Ultimately, all excitatory and inhibitory signals that control movement converge on the motor neurons that extend out of the brainstem and spinal cord to innervate the skeletal muscles of the body. So these neurons are also known as lower motor neurons, or LMNs. They have their cell bodies in the brainstem and the spinal cord. Now, from the brainstem, the axons of the LMNs will extend through cranial nerves to innervate skeletal muscles of the face and head. And from the spinal cord, the axons of the LMNs will extend through spinal nerves to innervate skeletal muscles of the limbs and the trunk. Now, neurons in 4 very distinct but highly interactive neural circuits, collectively termed the somatic motor pathways, participate in control of movement by providing input to lower motor neurons. So first we have the local circuit neurons. So this is where input arrives at lower motor neurons from nearby interneurons that are called local circuit neurons. Now these neurons are located close to the lower motor neuron cell bodies in the brainstem and spinal cord. They receive input from somatic sensory receptors, and these local circuit neurons will help to coordinate rhythmic activity, things like walking. Then we have upper motor neurons, also called UMNs. Now both local circuit neurons and lower motor neurons receive input from the upper motor neurons. And these upper motor neurons from the cerebral cortex are really essential for the execution of voluntary movements of the body. Pretty much all voluntary movements have to go through these upper motor neurons. Then we have basal nuclei neurons. So these assist movement by providing input to the upper motor neurons. Neural circuits interconnect the basal nuclei with motor areas of the cerebral cortex via the thalamus and also the brainstem. And then lastly are the cerebellar neurons. These will also aid in movement by controlling the activity of the upper motor neurons. So we can see all those different types of somatic motor pathways here. So here we have these lower motor neurons down here. So you can see that they're going to receive input directly from these local circuit neurons in the brainstem and the spinal cord. This is going to be that purple arrow. It's also going to receive direct input from the upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex, from the green arrow here, and also from the upper motor neurons in the brainstem. Going to get direct connection to those lower motor neurons. And then neural circuits involving the basal nuclei neurons and also the cerebellar neurons. These are going to regulate the activity of upper motor neurons. So these are going to be in the red arrows here. Now, a really prime function of the cerebellum is to monitor differences between intended movements and movements that are actually performed. Then it's going to issue commands to the upper motor neurons to reduce errors in movement. So one of the main functions of the cerebellum, monitor differences between intended movements and the movements actually performed, and then make commands to reduce errors. Then make appropriate adjustments. The axons of the upper motor neurons extend from the brain to lower motor neurons by two types of somatic motor pathways, either direct motor pathways or indirect motor pathways. Now, these direct motor pathways provide input to the lower motor neurons by axons that extend directly from the cerebral cortex. The indirect motor pathways provide input to the lower motor neurons from motor centers in the basal nuclei, from the cerebellum, and from the cerebral cortex. Nerve impulses for voluntary movements will propagate from the cerebral cortex to lower motor neurons by direct motor pathways. Now, there are two direct motor pathways that are used for this voluntary movement. They are the cortical spinal pathways and the cortical bulbar pathways. So there's actually two types of cortical spinal pathways, the lateral cortical spinal and ventral cortical spinal. But these are the two main pathways that are going to be used for voluntary movement. So the cortical spinal pathways, these are going to conduct impulses for the control of the muscles of the limbs and trunk. So these control the muscles, the limbs, and the trunk. So the axons of the upper motor neurons in the cerebral cortex form the cerebral spinal tracts, and these are going to descend through the internal capsule of the cerebrum and the cerebral peduncle of the midbrain. So we can see they cross through this internal capsule here in the cerebrum. and then also through the cerebral peduncle in the midbrain here. So this figure here first shows the lateral cortical spinal pathway, and this one has axons that decussate in the medulla, and they continue in the lateral white column of the spinal cord. So these pathways are going to start in the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex here at the top. And this is a descending pathway. So our information is going to be going down through the cerebral peduncle and then decussate at the pyramids in the medulla, and then continue down the lateral white column of the spinal cord. Now these axons will synapse with local circuit neurons or with the lower motor neurons in the anterior gray horn of the spinal cord. So you can see that synapsing right here in that anterior gray horn there. Now axons of the lower motor neurons will exit the cord in the anterior root of the spinal nerves, and it'll terminate in skeletal muscles that control movements of the distal parts of limbs. So that's going to be an important part about the lateral pathway, is that it's controlling the distal parts of limbs. So this is the lateral cortical spinal pathway. So cortical spinal axons that don't decussate in the medulla, these form the anterior cortical spinal pathway. And they will travel in the anterior cortical spinal tract in the anterior white column of the spinal cord. And at each spinal cord level, some of the axons will decussate by the anterior white commissure. And then they synapse with local circuit neurons or lower motor neurons in the anterior gray horn. So you can see we can actually see this decussation happening right here in that anterior white commissure. This pathway, just like the lateral cortical spinal pathway, will still travel through the internal capsule in the brain, down through the cerebral peduncle in the midbrain, and through the pyramids of the medulla. It's just going to decussate at the level of the spinal cord where it exits. Axons of the lower motor neurons will then exit the cord of the anterior roots of the spinal nerves, and they're going to terminate in skeletal muscles that control movements of the trunk and the proximal parts of limbs. So the anterior cortical spinal pathway is controlling the proximal parts of limbs. And then our last direct motor pathway is the cortical bulbar pathway. So this pathway conducts impulses for the control of skeletal muscles of the head. So this So axons from the upper motor neurons up here, these are going to come from the cerebral cortex, and they're going to form that cortical bulbar tract, which descends along with the cortical spinal tracts through the internal capsule. This is the internal capsule of the cerebrum, and then it also travels through the cerebral peduncle in the midbrain. So it kind of follows the cortical bulbar
tracts follow along with those cortical spinal tracts through this pathway. Now, some of the axons of the cortical bulbar tract will decussate, while others do not. And we can see that right here. So the axons terminate in the motor nuclei of 9 pairs of the cranial nerves in the brainstem. These are going to be the oculomotor nerve, which is the 3rd cranial nerve, the trochlear nerve, which is the 4th cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, which is the 5th cranial nerve, abducens, which is the 6th cranial nerve, facial, which is the 7th, glossopharyngeal, which is the 9th, vagus, which is the 10th, accessory, which is the 11th cranial nerve, and then also the hypoglossal, which is the 12th cranial nerve. Now, the lower motor neurons of the cranial nerves convey impulses that control very precise voluntary movements of the eyes, tongue, and neck. These include things like chewing, facial expression, speech, and swallowing. Next, we have the indirect motor pathways. So these are also called extrapyramidal pathways because so far we've seen that the motor pathways will go through the pyramids of the pyramids within the medulla, but these are going to be extrapyramidal, so outside of the pyramids. Now these will include all somatic motor tracts other than the cortical spinal and cortical bulbar tracts. Axons from the upper motor neurons that give rise to the indirect motor pathways, they're going to descend from various nuclei in the brainstem into 5 major tracts of the spinal cord, and they terminate on local circuit neurons or lower motor neurons. So these 5 indirect motor pathways, these are going to be the rubrospinal, tectospinal, vestibulospinal, lateral reticulospinal, and medial reticulospinal tracts. Now we're not going to look at these specifically, but just know that those are the 5 extrapyramidal pathways. So here again we have a nice summary table in the next couple slides. Here we can see the lateral cortical spinal tract. This conveys nerve impulses from the motor cortex to skeletal muscles on opposite side of the body for very precise voluntary movements of the distal parts of limbs. And then we have the anterior cortical spinal tract, again conveying nerve impulses for the from the motor cortex to skeletal muscles on opposite side of the body for movements of the trunk and the proximal parts of limbs. And then down here we have the cortical bulbar pathway or cortical bulbar tract. This conveys nerve impulses from the motor cortex to the skeletal muscles of the head and neck. And this is to coordinate very precise voluntary movements. Then we have the extrapyramidal pathways, or these are the indirect motor pathways. Now these will have different functions depending on which area of the spinal cord it's in. The rubral spinal tract conveys nerve impulses from the red nucleus. And this goes to those contralateral skeletal muscles or muscles on the other side of the body. And these are going to, again, govern very precise voluntary movements of distal parts of the upper limbs. The tectospinal tract conveys nerve impulses from the superior colliculus to skeletal muscles on the opposite side of the body that will reflexively move the head, eyes, and trunk in response to visual or auditory stimuli. So this tectospinal pathway is going to be the one that reacts to loud noises
or visual stimuli. That reflex, visual reflex and auditory reflex, will be along this tectospinal tract. Then we have the vestibulospinal tract. This conveys nerve impulses from the vestibular nucleus to skeletal muscles on the same side of the trunk and also proximal parts of limbs. This is going to be mainly for maintaining posture and balance in response to moving your head quickly. And then lastly are the medial and lateral reticulospinal tracts. These are going to convey nerve impulses from the reticular formation in the brain to skeletal muscles on the same side of the body for the trunk and proximal parts of the limbs, again mainly for maintaining posture and regulating muscle tone, but this is in response to ongoing body movements. And that is the end of chapter 12.